From the towering Wasatch Mountains of the American Southwest, we welcome you to this episode of Undiscovered Utah. This show focuses on the mysteries that surround the rugged, difficult, and sometimes deadly American Southwest. I'm your host, JB, and tonight we are going to share with you a story that you most likely never knew happened in the state of Utah. Let me tell you something. It is so important that we learn from our past. All too often, history repeats itself, and sometimes not in a good way. All of us at one time or another have done something in our lives that we are not proud of, and we wish we would never have gone down that road. But we did. So now the best thing we can do is learn from our mistake and try to avoid them in the future. The state of Utah as a whole has had a few of these accounts that we wish never would have taken place, but they did. And we need to make sure we learn from these experiences so that we don't repeat them. To learn from them, we must remember them. All too often, we just want to forget it ever happened and put it behind us. That can be a very dangerous thing to do for the reason I stated above. So what the heck am I talking about? Utah is a pretty great state. What did we do that was so bad? Well, it wasn't just Utah. It was the entire United States. Utah just played a major role in the event. It was the month of December. Families across Utah were making preparations for Christmas. The Great Depression had ended 2 years earlier, but many were still trying to recover from the stock market crash of 1929. The average standard of living in America was about 60% lower in 1941 than before the crash. But things were slowly getting better. On December 7th, 1941, everything changed for the United States. The Japanese government bombed the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor. And just like that, the United States had joined World War II. The level of fear that people were feeling along the western coast of the United States was at a feverish pitch. The United States had many military bases along the west coast. Fear of an attack on the mainland seemed highly probable. In the states of Washington, Oregon, and California lived many people that came from Japan as either first-generation immigrants or they had been born and raised in the United States. But as I said before, the fear was at a feverish pitch, and many in the United States suddenly didn't trust their neighbors of Japanese descent. The fear was that their allegiance might be more towards Japan than the United States. Something had to be done, right? On February 19th, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, through an executive order, ordered all Americans of Japanese ancestry be forcibly removed, if necessary, from their homes and placed in prison camps. These Americans of Japanese ancestry were relocated to prison camps that were quickly built to house the 120,000 Japanese Americans that were ordered to relocate. In Hawaii, 1/3 of its population was of Japanese descent. Many were arrested in mass incarcerations, and many were shipped to the mainland United States to a newly built prison camp. Some military leaders petitioned the U.S. government to also include all Americans of German and Italian ancestry. and moved them to prison camps also. However, apparently the gathering up of Americans of European descent wasn't quite as popular. Both the governor of California and the Attorney General of California declared to Congress that all Japanese should be removed from the state of California. The U.S. Attorney General Earl Warren did not feel the same way and pleaded with President Roosevelt not to sign the executive order and to perform more targeted security measures. But President Roosevelt signed the order into law. Milton S. Eisenhower from the Department of Agriculture was assigned to lead the effort of rounding up the Japanese Americans and moving them to prison camps throughout the United States. However, Eisenhower resigned after a couple of months in protest of what he referred to as incarcerating innocent citizens. Anyone that was at least 1/16 Japanese was ordered to relocate. On March 24th, the U.S. Army began to forcibly remove people. The Japanese Americans had 6 days' notice. In this time, they were required to dispose of all of their belongings that they could not carry with them. All men, women, and children were sent to assembly centers to be registered and counted. Then they were moved to relocation centers. There were 10 total relocation centers or prison camps. 2 of these relocation centers were built in Arizona, and they were built on Native American reservation land. The tribal leaders protested this action, but were overruled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Another one of these prison camps was built right here in Utah. The camp in Utah became known as Topaz due to its proximity to Topaz Mountain. Camp Topaz had over 11,000 Japanese Americans that were once housed there. The camp was 1 square mile in size and was surrounded by 2 rows of tall razor and barbed wire fencing. The camp also had 7 guard towers and a sentry post. When the camp first opened, most of the buildings were still under construction. The people being incarcerated here had to help complete their own barracks. Each barracks housed between 250 and 300 internees. There were 42 blocks, and each block had 12 barracks. The barracks were made of pine planks covered with tar paper on the outside. On the inside, sheetrock was added for insulation. Living conditions inside the barracks were not overly pleasant. Each barracks had a potbelly stove, army cots, mattress covers, and blankets. All other furniture had to be constructed by the Japanese internments. The camp at Topaz was located northwest of Delta, Utah, in the severe desert. This area of Utah has harsh weather. It's usually very windy. Winters are very cold, and summers are very hot and dry. With most of the Japanese Americans that were interred at Topaz being from San Francisco in the Bay Area, this must have seemed like a desolate hell. Even with the hardships these poor people had to live with, the Topaz camp was considered one of the quieter camps of the 10 that were built. However, there was still tragedy at the Topaz camp. In April of 1943, a 63-year-old man by the name of James Hatsuki Wakasa was out for a stroll near the perimeter fence. A guard warned the older man to back away from the fence line. The old man didn't respond and kept walking. We don't know the reason why the older man kept walking. Maybe he couldn't hear well or didn't understand English very well. Or he maybe have been just distracted. I guess it really doesn't matter why. The fact is he didn't back away from the fence and was shot and killed. 1 month later, a couple that was out walking by the fence were shot at by a guard. After this, the military was restricted on using weapons at the camp, and security was relaxed. Internees could actually get permission to leave the camp for recreational activities in nearby towns like Delta. On each block, a recreation room, laundry/bathroom combo room, and a dining hall were constructed. Schools were also constructed. There were 2 elementary schools and 1 junior/senior high school. A hospital and a church were also built. In total, there ended up being 623 buildings at Topaz. In 1943, a woman by the name of Mitsuya Endo was a native-born U.S. citizen of Japanese descent. Prior to being interred at Topaz, she worked for the state of California. Endo was contacted by a civil liberties lawyer by the name of James Purcell. Purcell asked Endo if she would be willing to be a test case to help challenge the incarceration and relocation centers. Endo was released from her job with the state of California when she was taken from her home and sent to the internment camp. Purcell filed a writ of habeas corpus on her behalf, stating that, quote, "She is a loyal and law-abiding citizen of the United States, that no charge has been made against her, that she is being unlawfully detained, and that she is confined in a relocation center under armed guard and held against her will." Purcell went on to demand that Endo either be charged with a crime or be released. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1944. The Supreme Court ruled that admittedly loyal citizens could not be deprived of their liberty and held in relocation centers. This decision effectively ended the incarceration of Japanese Americans. Topaz was closed on October 31st, 1945, 2 months after the end of World War II. After the closing of the Topaz camp, many buildings were sold to local residents and hauled away for other uses. My grandfather received one of the barracks and turned it into a milking barn for his cows. For many years I played in and around the old milking barn, having no clue of the history of the building. Today you can visit the site of the Topaz Interment Camp. You can walk the deserted streets and see the old foundations. You should stop by and try to imagine what it would be like to all of a sudden be considered an enemy of the state, ripped away from your home and all your possessions, and taken to a prison camp in the middle of the Utah desert. If you visit the Topaz site, there are 2 monuments that will help explain some of the history. One of the monuments is dedicated to the Japanese Americans that were incarcerated at Topaz and who also served their country, the United States of America, during World War II. The camp is now a National Historic Landmark. Nearby in the town of Delta, Utah, is a nice museum that you really should visit. You will learn more about this time period and the hardships these people had to endure. You can also schedule a guided tour of the Topaz site at the Topaz Museum or visit them online at topazmuseum.org. If you live along the Wasatch Front, you can easily make a day trip to Topaz and the museum in Delta. I highly recommend you take your kids and grandkids and teach them about this important time in our history. Chances are they are not going to learn much about this topic in school. We must learn from our mistakes and never take away the constitutional rights of our citizens just because of their ancestry, religion, or political affiliation. Today, as I record this podcast, we in many ways are repeating history and not in a good way. Our economy is on the verge of collapse. Big and small banks alike are failing or close to it. The markets are in absolute turmoil. The world financial system as a whole is teetering on the edge of a complete meltdown. And as I speak, the possibility of World War III inches ever closer. Good grief, have we really learned anything from our past? For the sake of all of us, I pray we have. That's it for tonight's show, everyone. Thank you for listening. If you would like more information about this episode or the Topaz site, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at info@undiscoveredutah.com. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, and be sure to follow us. Just search for Undiscovered Utah. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Undiscovered Utah. Join me next week as I share more about the Great Southwest. Good night, everybody.